Hello and welcome to the latest podcast from Rugby Elim. This month we've started a new series of sermons looking at the I am sayings of Jesus in John's Gospel. And so I'm meeting to have a conversation today with Joe. So welcome, Joe.
Hello.
And we're going to be looking together at these sayings, their significance and what they mean for us. As I said, the I am sayings are only found in John's Gospel. And that means there's something significant in John's thinking about this whole phrase or couplet, I am. And I wonder, Joe, if you could perhaps start us off with your thoughts about why that phrase is so important and maybe where it comes from.
Yeah, I think, as you rightly say, I think they only appear in John's Gospel. And I think that's an interesting point to start with because John's Gospel was written a little later than all the other Gospels. And so it kind of signifies a longer, more sustained reflection, theological reflection on the person of Jesus. And so these statements are really windows into the identity of Jesus that John had written down after a long time of reflecting on the person of Jesus and the revelation that he's had over all of those years of reflection. So they're an amazing opportunity for us to dig into who Jesus really is. Yeah,
they are a clearer statement. But just to clarify, when you put it like that, Joe, do you mean that, in fact, John came up with these phrases?
No, that's I guess not what I'm saying. But I think like they are on the lips of Jesus for a reason. And so Jesus is revealing his identity to us. But I think the way that John frames these statements and the order and then the context for each one, because each one has its own context in the story, they all kind of open a window up for us that help us to see Jesus.
Yeah, and maybe because of this period of reflection you talked about, that John has maybe got a greater understanding of their significance than some of the earlier gospel writers.
Yeah, I think it's not controversial to say that like John's gospel is deep like theology, whereas some of the synoptic gospels are very much biography. John's gospel is biography with deep theological reflection, and so it's a treat to dig into these sayings of Jesus.
Yeah, I remember I became a Christian at a Billy Graham rally many, many years ago. And we were given a copy of John's Gospel to read, which when I shared this with others at the time, they thought that was rather strange because it's a more complex gospel to understand. Yeah. It's not simply the story of Jesus' life, but it's because of the profound truths that it contains.
Yeah. And I think once again, the many years that John had to mull over just like of who Jesus was and the impact that he had on his personal life. And that comes through in every chapter of John's Gospel. Yeah.
Okay, so they're significant in what they tell us about Jesus' understanding of himself, but where do they come from? What does this idea of this phrase, I am, originate? Why does that? Because that's a word we use all the time. I'm going to Sainsbury's. Yeah. So where does that all come from?
Yeah, I mean, I personally go to Aldi, but whatever floats your boat. Yeah, but yeah, that's a really good point. And Kevin kind of alluded to it in his sermon on Sunday, that these I am statements are rooted in the very name of God. And we find that going back to Exodus chapter 3, where Moses meets the divine God in a burning bush. And this is where God reveals his personal name to Moses. And he reveals with this phrase, I am what I am, or I will be what I will be. But this I am that is carried forward and becomes the name Yahweh. So, and there's kind of all sorts of grammatical things that why it becomes Yahweh, because the Hebrew phrase is Echye, Asher Echye, and so that Echye becomes Yahweh. And so that's the name, the divine name throughout the whole of the Old Testament. And it's that name that Jesus is latching onto when he's using these I am statements. And it's most, I think, potent in that interaction in John chapter 8, where he's having with the Pharisees, where he says, before Abraham was, I am.
Yeah.
Which is just like, it's bad grammar, but it's great theology. Jesus is making a point.
Yeah. And God shared this name with Moses in response to Moses' question when God's telling him to go to Pharaoh and said, well, who shall I say sent me? And God says, I am sent me.
And I was thinking about this today. I think it's an interesting one because Moses kind of assumes that the people of Israel are gonna want to know, okay, who is this God that you saw in the desert? What's his name? Which implies that they have an understanding of the God that is their God and the name that he has. And actually, if you go back to Genesis chapter 4, the very end of Genesis chapter 4, it says, at this time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. And so there's some kind of understanding of the personal name of God from all the way back in Genesis chapter 4. And so it's not hard to see that there's in the Israelite community some recollection of the personal name of God. But what's interesting is Moses didn't necessarily know that personal God. He was raised an Egyptian. And so he was meeting God for the first time in Exodus chapter 3. And it's really powerfully articulated in that story. But yeah, this personal name of God is one revealed to Israel, revealed to Moses, and then carried through the whole of the Old Testament.
So what does it mean about Jesus' understanding of himself that he says, I am ...
Yeah.
Is he claiming to be God?
I mean, that's what it looks like to me, and that's certainly what the Pharisees believed, and that's eventually what ended up getting him crucified. I think some people, maybe kind of skeptics, will say that Jesus never claims to be God, but in that case, it's very hard to see why Jesus would have been crucified if he wasn't transgressing some law, and the law that he was allegedly transgressing was blasphemy, which, I mean, technically would be true if he wasn't God, but he actually is, and so it's not blasphemy. But these I am statements are, I think, clear indicators that Jesus is mapping himself onto the God of the Old Testament, who revealed himself by name to the people of Israel, which is really powerful.
Yeah. And when we come to look at the individual phrases, we'll see even more clearly, I think, that Jesus is indeed claiming to be God.
Yes.
I am the way, the truth, the life.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
We'll come on to that in a minute. So, let's move on then to look at each of these statements just briefly. We're having a sermon on each one over the summer, so that's like half an hour or so. But we had our first one this Sunday when Kevin was preaching, and he was preaching on I am the light of the world. Now, you mentioned already that you were listening to what Kevin was saying, which is good to know. What were some of the key things that he brought out of that passage?
Yeah, so he had 3 points as his kind of standard for any sermon. And the first being that, we must not be blind to the darkness. So Jesus comes saying that he is the light of the world, and that also means that there is darkness in the world, and that we need to be aware of that and awake to that. And he interestingly drew on the story in John's Gospel, where the woman who was caught in the act of adultery was brought before him, and that there was spiritual darkness at work there with the condemnation brought by the religious leaders. And so that's something that we need to be awake to and aware of, but we also need to be people who walk in the light of Jesus. And this was a real powerful challenge, I thought, to be walking in the ways of Jesus, to be walking in purity and in holiness, and coming out of the darkness and into the light, which is something that every Christian is called to do. And then the third idea was to reflect the light of Jesus. We want to be people who carry the light of Jesus into the world, because Jesus says in Matthew's gospel that you are the light of the world, and a city on a hill cannot be hidden. And so that is our calling, that is our vocation as followers of Jesus, is to bring the light of Jesus into the darkness of the world. Yeah.
Okay. We're going to come back at the end to Kevin's challenge to us at the end, but let's move on then to look at some of the other in fact, all of the other sayings. Now, for some reason in our sermon series, we're not going through them in the order they are in the Bible.
Yep, no idea why.
The one that Kevin was preaching on actually occurs second in John's Gospel in chapter 8. But the first one, which appears in John chapter 6, and Pastor John is preaching on that on the 18th of August, is I am the bread of life. Jesus talks a lot about bread, doesn't he? And it's a theme that does actually occur in the other Gospels as well. So perhaps you'd kind of introduce us to that just a little bit.
Yeah, so this occurs at the point where Jesus is feeding the 5,000. And they are so enamored, this great crowd, by the fact that they got free food at this rally, that they were like, oh, we should go back to this guy. He's catering at this place. It's amazing. And so Jesus is talking to them about the fact that, you're only here because you got bread last time. But if you really want bread, I am the true bread. I am the bread of life. And so he's harking back to the Exodus wilderness travelings of the people of Israel.
The manna in the wilderness.
Exactly. Yeah. And Jesus saying that he is true bread from heaven. And that whole kind of interaction ends kind of strangely, doesn't it? Where Jesus says, if you eat my flesh and drink my blood, then you have life in you. And people are like, oh, I'm not sure about this. This is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? But what's interesting is that this is kind of the communion language that Jesus uses in the other Gospels. And I think it's important to note that in John's Gospel, at the night before Jesus is betrayed, there is no communion. There is a meal, but what Jesus institutes is this foot washing thing, and he washes the feet of his disciples. And the communion aspect in John's Gospel actually is here in John chapter 6, this idea of partaking in the body and the blood of Jesus, which is really important. I mean, as a Anglican or former Anglican, I think there's
current
Anglican, yeah, sure. There's a high value placed on communion in your life, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's through that we remember who Jesus is and all that he's done for us. It's a very powerful symbol for us of life.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm looking forward to hearing more about what John has to say about that when it comes to him. But so we move on then to what is then, we've had the second saying, which was Kevin's, I'm the light of the world. The third is, I am the gate, or I am the door, which we find in chapter 10. Now, I'm preaching on this one on the 11th of August. So, Joe, all the help you can give me now would be much appreciated.
I mean, I don't know if I can give you much help. I find this one to be the most kind of confusing, to be honest. It's a door is not a very flattering object. Of all the things you could choose, I am the door. It's a bit underwhelming. I don't know what your thoughts are on that one.
Well, I mean, it is the only inanimate object that Jesus likens it. Well, I suppose bread is inanimate. Oh, okay. But anyway, the door, it seems to me, has two aspects that a door protects.
Sure.
So he's talking about sheep coming into a sheepfold and that he is the door to that sheepfold. So once the sheep are in there, they're safe because they're protected by him. But a door is also talking about the way in. Mm-hmm. And he talks also about robbers and thieves kind of coming into the sheepfold, kind of breaking in and clambering over the walls. So, I'm kind of thinking, what are the ways that we actually try to get into God's presence by our own efforts?
Oh, interesting.
Whereas that's not the way to get in. The way into God's presence is through Jesus. It's those kind of ideas that I'm going to be exploring next month.
Yeah, lovely.
But we'll see that a lot of these overlap as well.
Yeah.
With some of the other ones. In fact, when you come to preach on the way, the truth, and the life, I may have pinched some of the things that you were going to say.
We'll see.
but it'll reinforce it, won't it?
Yeah.
So, okay. The next one is I Am the Good Shepherd, which John's preaching on the 4th of August. So this is where you've got this imagery of the Good Shepherd and the sheepfold are all kind of intermingled.
Yes.
But the idea of the Good Shepherd, that again goes back to the Old Testament, to passages in Ezekiel and so forth. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so in Ezekiel, God is depicted as a shepherd of the flock of Israel. And he's kind of angry at the kind of sub-shepherds that he's placed over Israel, the leaders, both kind of political and spiritual leaders, who have done a bad job of looking after Israel. That Israel have been allowed to go off into idolatry, and so God kind of comes and says, you know what? I am the good shepherd, and I am going to look after this flock. And so Jesus is, in no uncertain terms, like again, he's mapping himself onto this image of God as the one who comes to shepherd the flock of Israel. And what's lovely, actually, in John chapter 10, when Jesus talks about this, is that he says, "I have other sheep also who are not in this sheep pen, and they're going to come with me as well." And I think that refers to the Gentile inclusion. So Jesus is both the shepherd of Israel, but also he's the shepherd of all who are going to come into the fold who believe in the name of Jesus, and that's us, and that's a great privilege. So he's our shepherd, and I think this image is probably the easiest for us all to kind of understand. We roughly know that shepherds look after sheep and care for them, and we can see how Jesus cares for us and looks after us and lays his life down for the sheep, lays his life down for us as he does when he went to the cross. And so I think that's a really beautiful image that we can all kind of resonate with really well. Yeah.
Looking forward to that one.
Yeah.
Then the 5th statement is, I'm the resurrection and the life. Now, Kevin's preaching on this right at the end of the series on the 1st of September. And this comes from John chapter 11. Tell us about this, Joe.
Yeah, well, this occurs when Lazarus passes away, and Jesus comes to the grieving friends and family, including Mary and Martha, and he has a really, a really powerful interaction with the two of them, and to Martha, he says this phrase, "I am the resurrection and the life," and it's a way of, I guess, encouraging the grieving sister that she will see Lazarus again, not just at the end of the age when all people are raised from the dead, but that Jesus actually in himself carries the power of resurrection life, and he demonstrates that by raising Lazarus from the dead. And so the resurrection is not this kind of ethereal idea that comes at the end of the age, as you know, if you read the Old Testament, it's there, but it's kind of loosely there. But Jesus comes to say, I am the resurrection and the life. It's gonna come through me. I hold that power, and he demonstrates it by raising Lazarus to the dead, but also by being crucified and being raised to life again. And we have a sure and certain hope in Jesus that we have resurrection life awaiting us through the merits of Jesus. So that's a great one.
It's so powerful, isn't it? We better move on quickly. We're running out of time now. Okay. So the next one, the 6th one, this is what you're preaching on next week from John 14. This is a passage that I use quite a lot when I'm taking funerals. Sure. Because Jesus talks about preparing a place for us to go when we die. And he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.
Yeah.
What preparation have you done for this Sunday?
Yeah, loads, as you can imagine. I think what's jumping out at me at the minute with that one is this idea that Jesus is exclusively the way to the Father. I think sometimes people say that Jesus doesn't make any claims to exclusivity, or there are many ways to God, many routes to God. And I think in our culture, it's maybe an uncomfortable truth that actually the fact of the matter is Jesus himself says there is no other way apart from me. And so it's a real kind of powerful reminder that Jesus is the hope of the world, and we need not be ashamed to offer Jesus to our neighbors, to our friends, because there is no other hope and there is no other salvation. And I think what's also interesting, that the truth, Jesus is the truth. And because I think with that exclusivity can come a pride and an arrogance, where we've got the right way, we know what's best. And but the reality is we're not here professing a true kind of dogma per se. We're not here proclaiming a true worldview. We're proclaiming a person,
yes,
who is the truth.
Yeah.
And that's a different thing. We're not here to trump anybody else's worldview. We're here to offer Jesus.
And we're not sharing our opinion either. We're quoting Jesus. This is what Jesus himself says.
Exactly.
It's not that I'm saying my religion's better than yours.
Yeah.
Jesus himself says, I am the way.
Yeah. Exactly that. Yeah.
Great. And finally then, the seventh saying, which John's preaching on the 25th of August, is I am the true vine. Now I've got a vine in my garden.
Oh, nice.
It grows really quickly once it's in the growing season, and you have to do lots of pruning of it. And this year I've got loads of fruit on it.
Nice.
I just hope it ripens in time.
Sure.
I'll let you come and have a look.
Yeah, that'd be lovely.
Tell us about the vine.
Yeah. So this is a beautiful image that comes in what is often called the upper room discourse, which goes from John chapter 13 through to chapter 17. Although at this point, I'm convinced that they're no longer in the upper room. They're walking to the Mount of Olives, and they probably pass a vine. Yes. And this is, I think, maybe where Jesus gets the inspiration to say, you know what, guys? I am the vine, and you are the branches. And yeah, this is a beautiful image of just our dependence on Jesus, the deep need that we have for him every day to do anything, to be fruitful in the Christian life, or just in life in general. We need to be connected to Jesus daily, to abide in him. That's the whole kind of remaining in Jesus and remaining in his love. And there have been a whole bunch of kind of devotional materials over the centuries based on this passage of just remaining in Jesus. And it's an essential reminder, I think, for all of us that we can do nothing apart from him. Yeah,
absolutely. And one thing I discovered about vines, which I hadn't realised before, I'd kind of assumed that there's roots and there's a trunk and there's branches. A vine doesn't have a trunk.
Okay.
It's only roots and branches. So Jesus is the vine.
Yeah.
There isn't a vine without
the
branches and the root. And
nice.
So Jesus is integral to the whole plant.
Yeah.
Anyway,
very good.
That give you that one for free.
Thank you.
Let's sum up then. Just with going back to Kevin on Sunday, he gave us a bit of a challenge to consider our own lives and what areas of shadow or darkness there were that we needed to illuminate. I wonder, I'm not asking you to share what the dark areas of your life are, but have you got a couple of practical ways we can examine ourselves and bring ourselves into the light?
Yeah. That's a really good question. And I guess what comes to mind for me is to kind of go back in our minds a few weeks ago when we had Tim Alford speaking here about silence. And just, I think, using that practice of silence and solitude and finding time to be alone with God, I think is essential for the Lord to illuminate those areas of your life. I think when you are alone in silence, it doesn't take long for those things to come up, and the kind of areas that need illuminating to make themselves known to you. And so I think that's kind of essential for that. I don't know if in the busyness of life that you can really pay attention to the stuff that is needing the Lord's touch. So I think that's an essential practice for that. Yeah.
Brilliant. Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing with us today, Joe. That's
thank you.
Really helpful. Thank you for listening. I hope that's whetted your appetite for the rest of this series. And I think Joe and I are going to come together for another session to sum up the whole series.
That'll be great.
We look forward to that then.
Yeah.
Goodbye.